Tonight we tour the medieval justice circuit at whisper volume, watch keys on hooks, quiet market court benches, the pillory after crowds leave, and the dungeon's stone hush. Soft sarcasm, no drama, plenty of footsteps and parchment. Lean back, breathe, and let the bureaucracy tuck you in. Though lords and kings ruled from castles and cities, most medieval villages lived day to day with little direct oversight. Yet even the smallest community needed someone to keep order, to guard against thieves, settle quarrels, and call help when danger came. In many places this work fell to the village watch and the sometimes distant but powerful sheriff. Together they formed the first thin line of law in a world where roads were lonely and justice slow. In a typical hamlet, the watch was no polished guard. It was a duty rotated among able-bodied men, sometimes chosen at the village moot, sometimes by lot. Each night 2 or 3 would rise from bed, wrap cloaks against damp, and take lantern and staff to patrol lanes, glamour by candle power. They checked barns, watched gates if there were any, and listened for trouble. A dog barking wildly, a stranger creeping near, fire crackling where it shouldn't. Their weapons were simple, stout cudgel, or billhook, perhaps a horn to sound alarm. Some villages owned an old crossbow or pike kept in the church porch, revered mostly for its seniority. Armour was rare, a thick cloak and courage were more common, yet the watch mattered, for most homes were timber and thatch. One spark could destroy all. They also kept eyes out for raiders, runaway serfs, or outlaws slipping through woods. By day, the role often passed to the constable or reeve, an elected or appointed man who kept lists of duties, carried messages, and acted as first voice of law. He might chase debtors, break up fights at the alehouse, and bring the accused before the Lord's manor court. His badge was often a staff tipped with iron or a simple seal ring showing authority. Though humble, the constable's word carried weight. To defy him risked fine or worse, and his patience had a famously short stride. Above these local figures stood the sheriff, the king's or lord's chief officer of a shire or county. Unlike the rotating watch, the sheriff was a permanent, powerful man, often of noble birth. He collected taxes, called out militias, hunted criminals, and enforced royal writs. Villagers seldom saw him except when serious crime or royal order reached their door. His men, the bailiffs, might ride in with warrants or demands for levy and impress everyone with bright livery and a tone polished to a shine. When theft or violence occurred, the village watch raised hue and cry. A horn or shout summoned neighbours. By law, all able men had to join the chase. Together they followed tracks into fields or woods, torches flaring, dogs baying. If they caught the culprit, he was bound, often with rope or chained in stocks, until the reeve or sheriff's man could judge. If he escaped, the watch kept signs, broken hedge, dropped shoe, direction of flight, the sort of clues hedges love to provide, to report later. Justice itself was slow and local. For small quarrels, a stray pig eating cabbages, a drunken brawl, the manor court or village moot settled with fines or public apology. The reeve kept record, the lord or steward presided. Greater crimes, murder, armed theft, treason, called the sheriff. He might summon a jury of neighbours, hold inquest, and send prisoner to larger Gaol. Punishments ranged from stocks and whipping to hanging at the shire gallows, and no one mistook the stocks for comfortable seating. Night patrol brought its own fears. Watchmen walked muddy tracks with flickering lanterns, hearing every ruster magnified by dark. Wind turned hedges to whispering shapes. Owls startled with sudden cry. Yet most nights were quiet. Dogs barked, lovers met secretly. A fox raided a henhouse and left opinions. Still, the thought of outlaw bands, real or imagined, kept men alert. Tales told by hearth often grew from watchmen's long walks. Festivals altered duties. On feast nights when ale flowed, the watch kept peace, gently guiding drunken dancers home or breaking fights that ran out of choreography. During fairs they checked stalls for theft and ensured tolls paid. Fires from bonfires or lanterns worried them most. One spark could leap to a roof and consume a whole street. Bells stood ready to call the bucket chain if blaze began. Religion touched this work. Watchmen might carry a blessed candle or relic against evil. Reeves swore oaths on the gospel. Rogation processions circled fields and paths each spring, blessing boundary markers that also served as patrol points. Priests sometimes joined the chase of a thief, ringing a handbell to rally help, a liturgy of urgency. Sheriff's visits were memorable. Trumpets and livery signalled his arrival, his mounted men inspected roads, read royal writ aloud or seized goods for tax. Villagers grumbled but obeyed. Sometimes a wanted man was dragged away in irons. Sometimes a fare held under his license brought brief prosperity. Though feared, the sheriff also symbolized the link to a larger realm, proof the king's peace reached Dane a tiny hamlet, eventually like weather. Economy shaped safety. Prosperous villages might hire a permanent guard or build a stout gate. Poor ones relied on mutual aid. Inns at crossroads posted their own watch to protect travellers. Markets attracted both buyers and pickpockets. Constables kept a wary eye. Tithes and tolls funded repairs of stocks, gallows or bridges to chase criminals. Civic pride measured in timber and iron. Season changed danger. Winter nights were long and dark. Thieves and hungry wolves alike prowled. Spring fairs tempted pickpockets. Summer brought wandering labourers after harvest, some honest, some not. Autumn meant moving grain and taxes, good loot for bandits. The watch kept eyes sharp and horns near, and boots reasonably dry. Despite hardship, service carried honour. A good watchman was a trusted neighbour. A firm but fair reeve might keep peace better than a distant lord. Songs praised brave constables who caught notorious thieves. Communities valued those who stood guard while others slept. At dawn, the watch ended. Men returned lanterns, banked the fire at the meeting point, and went home weary but safe. Life resumed, fields, forge and kitchen filled with sound. Yet every household knew the night's quiet owed much to those few who walked dark lanes with staff and courage, and a talent for not tripping over cats. So picture medieval law not as a vast police but as a humble network. Lanterns bobbing through fog, neighbours answering a horn, a reeve with a ledger, the sheriff's men thundering in when stakes rose. The village watch and the sheriff held fragile order, enough to keep fear at bay until sunrise, lit fields once more. Every world of order has its shadow, and in the Middle Ages that shadow often took shape as the Gaol, or, in a castle, the dungeon. These were not yet the organised prisons of later centuries. They were holding places, grim and practical, where law kept the accused or the condemned until judgment came. To step into one was to enter a space built less for comfort than for control, architecture with firm opinions, yet it also revealed much about how medieval people understood crime, punishment, and mercy. In a town, the ghoul might stand beside the guild hall or under the sheriff's court. It was a stone room or cellar with an iron-barred door, sometimes a whole tower given to justice. In villages, the holding cell might be no more than a lock-up near the church, or a strong room in the reeve's house. In castles, the dungeon lay deep vaulted chambers beneath thick walls, sometimes reached only by narrow stair or trapdoor. Cold seeped from stone, air smelled of damp and straw, torchlight flickered on iron rings set into walls like punctuation marks no one wanted to read. Gaolers keepers of these spaces were practical folk. Some were old soldiers, others trusted servants of a lord or sheriff. They lived above or near the cells, keeping keys on a heavy ring. Their work mixed routine and vigilance, feeding prisoners, cleaning when forced, preventing escape. Payment was often poor. Gaolers sometimes charged inmates for straw, better food, or looser fetters. Rich prisoners might buy relative comfort. Poor ones endured bare stone and thin gruel, learning that poverty negotiated badly. Most who entered were long-term inmates. Prisons held those awaiting trial before a lord's court or royal justices, debtors until payment made, or convicts briefly before punishment. Sentences of lifelong imprisonment were rare and costly. Execution, fine, or banishment came faster. Still, some languished for months while cases stalled or lords delayed, time kept by dripping water and distant bells. Daily life was spare. Light crept through a narrow slit, or none at all. Lamps burned smoky when the gaoler brought them. Bedding was straw if one could pay, bare floor otherwise. Food arrived once or twice. Bread, broth, water. Better fare if family sent or prisoner bribed. Chains might bind, ankles or neck to wall. Lesser cells allowed free movement within small space. Conversation murmured among captives when guards were out of earshot. News, prayers, pleas, and the occasional recipe improved entirely in theory. Not all cells were equal. Debt rooms were sometimes decent, shared by tradesmen who'd fallen behind. Felons might be thrown into deeper pits, literally oubliettes, forgotten places reached by rope. These rarely killed directly but crushed hope with dark and filth. Some castles kept wet dungeons near the moat, where water seeped cold and foul. Legends grew around such pits. Travellers whispered of skeletal remains and cries heard at night, because travellers are generous with whispers. Fear shaped the Gaol's air. Chains clinked, rats skittered, damp dripped. Prisoners prayed loudly or whispered bargains to saints. Some carved marks on the wall to count days. Hope rose when keys rattled, visitor, advocate, or gaoler bringing news of bail. Despair deepened when no one came. Executioners sometimes entered to measure a man or test a rope, grim reminders of the calendar ahead. Yet mercy appeared too. Families visited with food, blankets, and candles. Priests came to hear confession, give last rites, or offer comfort. Charitable guilds sometimes paid debtors' dues to free poor neighbours. Some lords pardoned on feast days. Some towns had custom of releasing minor offenders at Easter. Bells might ring when prisoners walked out forgiven, the sound travelling faster than relief. Trial days broke monotony. Prisoners were led to hall or courtyard, irons clanking, to face lord or sheriff. Juries of neighbours or sworn men heard the case. Oaths sworn on the gospel witnesses spoke. Sentences came swift, fine, whipping, stocks, or death. Those acquitted rejoiced. Those condemned returned briefly to the cell before punishment, the room already rehearsing their absence. Escape was rare but legendary. Stories tell of lovers bribing a gaoler, ropes smuggled in wine casks, monks tunnelling from a cell. Most ended in recapture and harsher fate, but a few succeeded, vanishing into forest or distant town. Tales told for years around hearths, polished by retelling until even the rope seemed to nod along. Dungeon life inside castles carried special weight. Political prisoners, rival nobles, captured knights were sometimes kept for ransom. They might have decent quarters with books, wine, even servants, yet remained closely guarded. Others endured harsh isolation. The same castle could hold both, a lord's rival dining above rats while a peasant thief rotted below, a lesson in hierarchy no one needed explained. Spiritual care was constant. Chaplains visited, prisoners confessed, seeking absolution before death. Some cells bore scratched prayers or crude crosses. Pilgrim badges and saints' images hung if allowed. Belief in saving the soul gave strength when the body failed, hope written in candle smoke. Gaols also served public spectacle. Stocks and pillories outside let townspeople jeer petty thieves. Markets filled with gawkers when prisoners paraded to the gallows. Justice was seen and felt, meant to warn as much as punish. Yet behind these moments lay long, quiet nights of fear and waiting in the cells. Season-marked suffering. Winter froze stone, water iced in jugs, breath hung white. Summer stank with rot and heat, vermin multiplied. Spring floods sometimes seeped into pits. Autumn brought damp chill. A prisoner's health often broke before judgment, hence wealth and bribes could mean survival. Poverty often meant death without sentence. Still, not all was cruelty. Some gaolers were kindly, bringing extra straw or food, passing letters, turning a blind eye to small comforts. Communities sometimes pressed for mercy when crimes were minor. The idea of justice mixed with local understanding. Thieves who stole bread to live might be whipped, not killed. Brawlers fined rather than maimed. Harsh yet human in its way. At dawn after execution night, silence deepened. A cell stood empty, straw left scattered. Other prisoners watched keys swing and wondered about their fate. Outside, villagers returned to work, perhaps sobered, perhaps merely relieved. Life went on, but memory of dark cells lingered. So when picturing medieval punishment, think beyond gallows to these dim stone rooms. The dungeon and the gaol held many kinds, debtor and traitor, poacher and knight. Fear dwelt there, but also prayers, small kindnesses and stubborn will to live. They remind us that justice then was both rough and personal, and that night behind bars was long indeed. Before the day's trade has fully swelled, when stalls are only half raised and the smell of fresh bread still drifts soft along the cobbles, a bell sounds from the Guildhall door. It is the church bell for prayer, nor the curfew that will come at dusk. This bell calls folk to the market court, the small, regular justice that keeps a town's everyday life from unravelling. Men and women look up from crates and counters, a few drift toward the hall. A pair of beadles clear a path with their staves. The law today is it the distant thunder of a king's decree, but the steady tread of neighbours meeting to set things straight, one loaf and one temper at a twos. The Guildhall smells of beeswax and old wood. Its long room is lit by narrow windows that catch slants of pale gold. Rushes crackle faintly underfoot. At the far end, beneath a painted board showing the town's arms, the portreeve or bailiff takes his place, flanked by aldermen in furred hoods. A clerk sits with ink and quill, a little knife for trimming the nib, the very portrait of patience. On the table lie the town's measures, a standard loaf, a brass ell for cloth, nested cups for ale, and, more solemn still, a small chest with the seal and charters. This is a chamber of weighing, not only of goods but of words, the sort of room where even a sigh feels carefully measured. People gather slowly, drawn by duty or curiosity. The ale taster stands ready, the bread weigher fingers his iron balance like a musician testing strings. Two beadles linger by the door with lanterns and staves, their faces serious but not unkind. A fishmonger whispering with her daughter steals a glance across the room to the butcher she has quarrelled with all week. A tanner, still faint with the perfume of his trade, ties back his sleeves. A weaver, hands scarred by loom strings, shifts from foot to foot and tries not to meet the glance of the dye merchant, whose madder, he says, arrived watered, a dispute already halfway dyed in the wool. The clerk calls the first matter, in a voice trained by years of reading charters in chilly rooms. A baker is brought forward by the eedle, his cap in his hands. The summer has been dry, flour-dear loaves have crept a little smaller, and the town grows hungry and cross. Today we will see if his bread rings true. The standard loaf is set on the table, the baker's loaf beside it. The balance swings. You can hear breathing, the soft tap of the clerk's knife on the board, the distant cry of a hawker in the square. The scale settles, The loaf is light, feather light, just fine for a bird light. Words come then careful as a mason's line. The baker pleads that the miller has taken too much toll, that the river ran low and the grinding failed, that he will mend. The ale taster lifts a brow, the beadles fold their arms, the aldermen exchange glances. The law here is its blind, it has eyes full of fields and weather. The portreeve weighs excuse against custom, and decides on a fine light enough not to ruin, heavy enough to be felt. The baker bows, his shame no less keen for being shared among neighbours. The clerk writes a neat line in the roll. The town exhales not cheer, just the warm breath of things made fair. Next comes a dispute of measures. A clothier claims the mercer sold him 3 ells that were 2 in a hand. The mercer insists the board was true and the line straight. The brass ell is brought forth, its edge smooth from generations of fingers. They set the cloth, they mark, they measure again. It falls short by the width of a child's thumb. A murmur runs like a small wind among those watching. The mercer flushes dark, he speaks fast and hot. The portreeve stills him with a lifted hand. It is not ruin the court intends, only the straightening of crooked things. Restitution is ordered, a promise taken for honest measure henceforth. The mercer nods, chastened and slightly shorter than he arrived by exactly 1 thumb. Then the matters grow smaller and oddly intimate, as if the town were turning out its pockets. A neighbour's pigs have rooted a kitchen garden. The owner swears his boy latched the gate, and perhaps he did, poorly. A washerwoman has hung her linens on a line stretched across a lane and tangled a cart. A journeyman has shouted insults at a rival outside the church porch. Each case is called, spoken, weighed. The court moves like a slow river over stones, finding the course that will keep peace without flooding fields. Fines are set, apologies demanded, promises written. The clerk's quill scratches and scratches, the sound like a cricket in summer reeds keeping course. Between each matter you can sense how custom girds these walls. No statute book lies fat and oracular, rather, memory circulates like warm air. As our fathers did, says an alderman, and a woman at the back nods because she remembers too when she was a girl, and stood here with a basket of onions to testify about a borrowed scale. The portreeve quotes last year's ruling on the ale pots. The ale taster reminds them of Candlemas when the Lord High Steward passed through and blessed their measures. This is at the roaring assize of a travelling judge, not the iron justice of kings. It is a daily stitching of rents and tears, strong thread, quiet hands. The door opens and a stranger is led in, a pedlar with a pack of pins and ribbons, boots muddy from 3 counties' roads. He has been accused of selling underweight thread and quarrelling with a guildsman who says such wares may be sold only by freemen of the town. The guild's warden speaks, his sash bright, his beard trimmed short. The pedlar replies with a cracked but steady voice, laying out the truth of mileposts, ferry tolls, and what he paid at the last fair. The court hears not only law now, but the breath of the wider world. The portreeve grants him leave to sell for the day, under the eye of the beadles, with warning to seek proper licence if he would linger. The guildman bows to the seal rather than the man. The pedlar bows to all, and goes out lighter than he came, if not in pack then in heart. Sometimes the market court steps in to stop a quarrel before it grows teeth. Today, 2 butchers stand shoulder to shoulder, flushed with the heat of their own pride, arguing over whose stall edges the shade and whose flies plague the other's table. They are big men with hands that know knives. The beadles watch with care. The portreeve listens, then orders a chalk line drawn on the cobbles and a change of places on alternate days until the weather turns. It is a simple solution, almost childish, and it works like cool water. The butchers scowl, then start to grin, then groan at themselves for being made boys again before their own apprentices. The court smiles in its beard, which is quite experienced at this. A pair of friars enter, sandals wet, robes dusty from the road. They have come to ask that the market cross be repaired. Pilgrims trip on its steps. A loose stone shook out under the last preacher and gave him a fright. The aldermen nod. The town is a body. If the knee fails, the back suffers. The bailiff assigns masons to the task and sets aside a little from the last levy on wine. The clerk writes a neat note for the mason's lodge, and one of the friars, who sings plain chant sweeter than a thrush, hums something gentle as he thanks them. The Guildhall softens, for song is an old cousin of justice. Toward midday, a case arrives like a stone dropped in still water. The watch has brought in a man who drew a knife at the alehouse the night before. No blood was spilled, his friends dragged him out, the horn was never blown, yet knives and ale are bad kin, and the town remembers other summers when such matters grew sharp and would not be sheathed. The man stands with his cap crushed in his hands. He is it hardened, he is only foolish, and his fear prickles the air like nettles. The Portreeve's face turns grave. The market court is it a gallows, but it is a toy. Testimony comes in like beads on a string, the alewife, the carter, a boy who saw the quarrel through the half-door. The man's shame deepens with each telling, and at last his shoulders fold. He begs forgiveness of the alewife. He swears on the cross to leave his knife at home on market days. The fine is fair, the warning firm. A second offence will go to the town prison below, the hall where damp stones keep bad company. The man bows so low his cap brushes the rushes. When he straightens, the net of the town has caught him and set him gently back on the bank instead of letting him drift into deep water. Between matters you notice small rituals that thread sense into the morning. The clerk sanding fresh ink with fine dust. The beadle tipping a cup of water to a sickly witness. The alderman checking the brass ell once more with the same tenderness a priest shows a relic. A child peeks around her mother's skirts. The Portreeve pretend not to see, then lets the brass cup pass into her fingers for a moment. She weighs it solemnly, mouth round with duty, and the whole hall smiles as if the town itself had briefly worn that little face. Occasionally the court brushes the edge of higher law. A letter with a green seal arrives from the sheriff, ordering that a certain trader were watched for smuggling wine from the bishop's port to the lord's manor. The Portreeve receives it with due respect, but he sets it beside the basket of onions and the complaint about a blocked lane, because for the town each matter sits in the same scale. How to live near one another without making life a wound. The clerk copies the letter carefully into the book and sends word to the watch captain to keep a quiet eye. At last the assize of bread and ale is called for the week. The ale taster strides forth, a man with a careful palate and a gift for surviving a great many sips before prime. He tastes from 3 jugs set out by the alewives, each cupped by its own small brand. He smacks his lips, he nods, he shakes his head at one that runs thin as river water. The alewife protests, grain dear, heat fierce, but the rule is steady as the bell. A fine, a warning, and a promise taken. Then the bread weigher lifts each loaf, and the scales speak in quiet tilts and clicks. When all is done, the clerk declares the week's prices. In the square beyond the door, the news runs through the crowd like a fresh, cool stream. Near the end, a matter of the lane is brought. A cartload of timber left 3 days running outside a carpenter's shop, blocking delivery to the baker's back door. The bread will be late because the boards are lazy, says an alderman, not unkindly, and the hall laughs because truth to be simple and still needs say. The carpenter nods, promises to stack farther within his yard. The baker promises to shout less and speak first. It seems a small thing, but wheels are small things, and they turn a city. The clerk reads out the fines and payments due. The beadle collects a few coins. The Portreeve marks the day closed with a rap on the table. Before the people drift away, the bailiff asks in a voice unadorned if any have other pleas. For sometimes the last thing said is the most important. An old widow steps forward then, thin as a straw, eyes bright with resolve. Her rent, she says, was raised beyond what the last charter allows. She has brought the paper, folded soft as linen from much handling. The aldermen lean in, The clerk smooths the page, the seal winks its waxy eye. Quiet settles like a cloth. There is a pause you can feel in your bones, the space where law climbs down from the rafters and sits at the same table as hunger. The portrait asks 3 questions. Not more? Who set the new rent? What counsel was taken? What custom stands? The widow answers plainly. She does not ask for mercy, no for measure. At last the portrait nods to the clerk, who writes an order that the rent to set back until assize day when the travelling justices ride through, and that meanwhile the reeve of the ward shall look in at the widow's roof and see what repairs must be done before winter. You can hear the whole town breathe again, not loudly, not with cheer, but with that quiet assent people make when they know something has been kept hold. When the session ends, the room does not empty at once. People mill softly. The baker pays, the mercer and clothier check the brass L one more tie, with rueful grins. The butchers, newly chastened, speak of sharing a cask of ale and moving the chalk line by mutual agreement if the sun grows cruel. The pedlar shoulders his pack. The friars depart in a drift of hymn. The widow folds the charter and tucks it beneath her cloak as if she were tucking in a child. The beadles set the standard measures back in their chest with the same care a mason uses for his best chisel. Outside, the square has grown loud. Stalls stand fully dressed. Geese complain in wicker prisons. A boy runs, pursued by a dog certain of biscuits. The market court has made its decisions, and the town rejoins itself without fuss, as a bone knits under a poultice. A bell rings again, this time from the church, not for law but for prayer, and for a moment the 2 bells mingle, secular and sacred, and the town stands where it always does, in the meeting of many duties under one sky. By afternoon, the clerk will sand the wet lines in his book and close it with a sigh familiar as the closing of a window. The portrait will drink a cup of watered wine and go out to look at the line between the butcher's stalls, a little amused at his own handiwork. The beadles will carry news to the wardens. The baker will weigh his dough with a care he sometimes forgets when the morning rush bites. Nothing grand has happened here, and yet the town lives by such mornings as a body lives by bread. In the evening, when the sun has gone and the lanterns glow in the lanes, people will retell some matters with more wit than truth. The mercer will become a scoundrel, the butchers buffoons, the friar a saint with a voice like honey. In a week the sting will be gone and the lesson will remain, as lessons do when they are wrapped in laughter. The widow will sleep easier, not because the law is a cudgel, but because it is a staff that helps her walk. So remember this room when you picture medieval justice. Not only the gallows on the hill or the distant thunder of royal writs, but this market court, where neighbours measure bread and measure words, where a brass L and a steady pen keep peace, where the law bends just enough to hold, like a willow switch woven into a fence. Here, under beams dark with smoke and banners faded by time, a town learns again each market day how to live together and call it fair. If the market court is the quiet stitching of a town's peace, the pillory is its sharp needle, public, humbling, and meant to mend what has torn. It stands often at the edge of the square or near the churchyard gate, a stout wooden frame with holes for head and hands, or sometimes only for the neck. Its presence is reminder and warning, but also strangely communal. To stand there is shame, to watch is lesson, to pass by is to weigh one's own conduct, a mirror you cannot avoid by looking away. The structure is simple. 2 uprights of timber, weathered by rain and sun, support a hinged board drilled with 3 round openings, 1 for the head, 2 for arms. Iron fittings hold it shut. A padlock or pin secures it. Some towns have stocks instead, holes for feet, leaving the punished seated. Some have cucking stools to duck scolds in water. But the pillory, tall and central, is most feared. Architecture that points a finger. Morning is the usual hour for penance. After the market court has judged, or after proclamation from the bailiff, the culprit is led out by beadles or watchmen. He or she may be a baker who cheated weight, a fishwife who sold rotten herring, a drunkard who drew knife, a slanderer who loosed tongue too far. Nobles rarely stand here. This is justice for townsfolk and tradesmen. The walk is part of punishment. Beadles carry their staves. Sometimes a small crowd follows, curious or jeering. The condemned may wear placard naming offence, farce measure, scold, drunkard, thief. Bells sometimes toll. At the square, the boards creak open. The head goes in first, then hands. When they close, there is sudden stillness, a person bound and lifted above everyday pace, no longer hidden among neighbours, learning how heavy a minute would be. Shame is the chief tool. People pause at stalls to look. Some laugh or toss jeers. Children point friends, avert eyes. Yet cruelty is it always the aim. Many watchers remain quiet, some sympathetic. It is expected to feel chastened but not broken. The sentence may last an hour, or until the market bell rings, rarely more than a day. Too long would be seen as harsh and risk pity turning to anger, a lesson some stewards learn the hard way. Still, humiliation can sting worse than whip. A proud tradesman feels weight of every stare, a gossip feels own words flung back. Some weep, some stand stiff and silent, some joke to show spirit. Once in a while a friend slips cup of ale to lips or pats shoulder. The town is it mob alone, it is many hearts weighing justice as they pass, all of them late for something, but stopping anyway. Mischief sometimes creeps in. Children throw soft clods or overripe fruit. Apprentices shout jests. In hard towns stones may fly, though beadles forbid it. Law wants spectacle, maiming. A aedle's staff or steward's glare can hush a rowdy crowd quickly. The boundary between lesson and cruelty is watched, if unevenly, a fence patched as needed. Some penances take ritual form. A scold, woman or man too quick of tongue, might stand holding heavy stone or wearing paper crown of shame. A cheating merchant might display false weights hung about his neck. A brawler may hold broken knife blade upright as warning. Occasionally offenders are forced to cry out confession aloud. I sold short measure, I struck in anger, I lied before the court. The words linger like smoke above the square, a sermon without a pulpit. Church and town sometimes mingle here. On holy days, offenders may be brought after Mass to kneel and beg pardon before congregation. A penitent might wear sackcloth, carry candle, or process barefoot around church while choir sings a psalm. Such public penance seeks not only to punish but to heal, to bring sinner back inside walls of grace. The curfew bell marks end of many sentences. Beadles unlock pillory, ease aching limbs free. Some punished hurry off, some pause to bow or cross themselves. Friends may gather quietly, shielding from lingering stares. It is strange mixture, humiliation and relief, rebirth of ordinary life after being spectacle. Despite its severity, townspeople often view pillory as practical mercy. It is cheaper than prison, swifter than long trial, less brutal than whipping or hanging. A day of shame to save a man's trade if he learns, a warning without ruin, and the visible nature of it keeps law transparent. All can see who judged, who punished, and why. The process as public as the penalty. Seasons alter the scene. In summer, bright sun glares on sweating face, but warmth softens long wait. Winter is hardest. Cold bites wrists and neck. Snow or rain soaks clothes, and crowd sympathy may grow. On feast days, crowds larger and more vocal. During Lent, silence heavier with reflection. Night punishments rare. Justice prefers daylight's steady gaze. Children remember these events vividly. A boy watching father's rival in pillory may learn measure of honesty. A girl seeing loudmouth neighbour shamed may think twice before echoing gossip. The memory sticks, shaping next generation's sense of fairness more than distant laws ever could, civics taught in the square. Yet the system can be bent. Wealthy merchants sometimes pay fine to avoid public shame. Guildmasters shield their own. Some poor souls suffer, while rich offenders slip away. Murmurs rise when this grows too obvious. Town pride rests on idea that pillory stands for all. A wise portreeve knows to balance mercy and equity, lest trust erode like mortar in rain. Faith lingers after punishment ends. Many walk straight from pillory to church door, kneel and whisper prayer for strength to mend life. Priests sometimes greet them with quiet absolution, for shame is heavy, but not meant to damn. The goal, however imperfectly met, is to reintegrate, to send neighbour home sobered, not destroyed. At dusk, when stalls fold and geese quiet, the empty pillory stands in square's corner like a silent sentinel. Children climb on it when no one minds, playing justice games. Lovers carve initials in its posts. Travellers glance and know this town keeps its own peace. The wood is worn smooth where countless hands have rested, heads bowed or lifted in stubborn pride. Think of it as barbarity alone, but as mirror of a close-knit world. A wrong there ripples through streets like water. Setting it right needs more than parchment. The pillory and public penance are raw and human, imperfect, sometimes cruel, but aiming to remind rather than destroy. In them we glimpse a society holding itself accountable with the tools it has, hoping the tools improve the people, and the people improve the tool. So when you picture medieval law, do not stop at royal writ or far-off gallows. See the town square, wood dark with rain, bell calling neighbours, offender standing humble while life flows on. Around them weave judgment, mercy, laughter, gossip, and eventual return. It is hard medicine, but meant to heal the body of the town. When the sun sinks behind the rooftops and shutters close one by one, the streets of a medieval town do not fall silent, they change voice. Merchants pack stalls, housewives call children in, the smell of hearth smoke thickens, but somewhere a horn sounds the curfew. Gates swing shut, guards fasten the great bar, and out from the guardhouse steps the town watch, lanterns in hand, bills and staves at their shoulders, keepers of the night, part warning, part lullaby. By day, authority lives in market court and guildhall. By night, it walks the lanes. Watchmen are drawn from varied cloth. Some are paid men-at-arms, veterans too old for hard war but still steady. Others are townsmen fulfilling duty, each craft sending one to serve when bell call. A captain of the watch commands, chosen for steadiness rather than swordplay alone. They gather at dusk, buckle belts, light horn lanterns shielded against wind, check that locks and keys hang safe, and tell themselves, as always, that nothing exciting would be best. The town itself changes with darkness. Streets narrow as fear, corners loom. The comforting bust of day thins to quiet. Only taverns spill light and laughter, sometimes too loud. Dogs roam, sniffing refuse. Somewhere a cart rumbles late, wheels echoing. The night watch knows each alley and gate, each tavern likely to brew quarrel, each yard where thieves might slip. Their feet on cobbles sound slow and deliberate, a warning and reassurance in one, the city's heartbeat set to a walking pace. First task is patrolling the walls and gates. They check hinges, test the great bar, peer over parapets at fields fading into dusk. Travellers arriving after gates shut may call for entry. Watch decides if safe to admit. Merchants who dawdled at fairs plead. Peasants laden with produce beg. Sometimes a known man is let in for fee. Strangers may wait till dawn in Gatehouse. Smugglers and spies fear this moment most, for a sharp-eyed captain can sniff falsehood like a hound with a university degree. Within the town, watch follows set beats. Main streets first, where lamps hung at corners burn low. They trim wicks, add oil, or light fresh torches when provided. Many towns demand each house hang a lantern outside. Fines await those who forget. Small lanes follow, darker and full of whisper. Here watchmen listen, for breaking shutters, hushed footsteps cry of alarm. Quiet crime thrives at night, petty theft, housebreaking, brawls by alehouse door. A quick knock of staves or cobble, or sharp hoe there, often scatters mischief before it blooms. Taverns and alehouses draw close attention. Laughter is fine, singing too, but drunken quarrels breed knives. Watchmen step inside now and then, lantern beam cutting smoke, to remind all of law. Alewives know them, sometimes bribe with mug of warm ale to keep good temper. If fight erupts, watch hauls offenders out, cools them in lock-up till morning court. Many a foolish lad sobers on straw cell floor after such night, swearing eternal reform until next payday. Some nights bring fires, greatest terror of medieval town. Watch sniffs for smoke, eyes roofs for telltale glow. A cry of fire changes. All bells ring, buckets form chains from well or river. Watch directs with urgent voice. Fire hooks pull down thatch to stop spread. In these hours, their authority is unquestioned. They save whole wards from ash, a heroism that smells of wet wool and smoke. Other dangers stalk dark footpads lying in wait for lone travellers, burglars prying shutters, smugglers shifting contraband, and sometimes wolves if gates stand near wild. Watch carries bills, polearms with hook and spike, good for both fight and hauling drunk from gutter. Horn or rattle warns comrades if trouble. Most foes melt at first shout, but a good watchman knows when to push and when to retreat for help. Courage measured with common sense. Religion shades the night. Watch may pause at church porch to pray, or bow passing shrine. Bells mark hours. Compline, then matins. Monks' chants drift over roofs while watch moves below. In some towns, patrols avoid cemetery paths, half from piety, half from fear of spirits. Superstitions run deep, charms in pockets, whispered psalms when shadow seems wrong. Yet duty keeps feet steady. Pay varies. Some towns give coin nightly, others grant exemptions from tax or guild duty. Rotating service means a weaver might walk one night, a smith the next, sharing burden. Permanent watchmen enjoy modest wage and steady bread, sometimes a small cottage by gate. Pride grows from roll. They guard sleep of neighbours, keep thieves at bay, and their lantern glow means safety to late-walking midwife or apprentice returning from errand. Seasons change work. Winter brings long, dark and bitter cold. Cloaks pulled tight, lanterns struggle against wind. Snow muffles footfalls, thieves love it. Summer nights short but lively with fairs, music, and drunken revels spilling into lanes. Harvest time sees wagon trains late. Watch must guide them safe past sleeping houses. In storms they hunch under cloaks but still pace. No weather excuses absent eyes. Sometimes watch aids justice directly. A thief caught may be held till market court. A murderer, rare but feared, kept under heavy guard for sheriff or lord's men. They serve writs, summon folk to appear before bailiff, escort prisoners to gallows on execution day. Their staves are less for killing than for control, yet weight enough to fell man if desperate. Persuasion with edges. Not all love the watch. Some grumble at curfew, fines for unlit lantern, or fees at gate. Young men play tricks, running ahead to douse lamps, shouting false alarms. But when real danger comes, fire, brawl, Strange riders, resentment turns to gratitude. A good captain balances firmness with neighbourly sense, knowing these streets hold his kin too. Curfew is serious. After bell, no one walks without night pass from bailiff or guild. Midwives, doctors, or messengers sometimes bear such writ. Others caught wandering answer to court, some fined, some put in stocks by dawn. This keeps peace, but also gives watch, cause to question every shadow. Midnight is hardest hour. Cold deepens, taverns quiet, an echo of watch boots and occasional bark of dog. They pause at crossroads, check locks on granary, listen to sleeping town breathe. A faint candle in window comforts someone awake, perhaps weaving or tending child. They are unseen guardians, often unthanked yet proud. Toward dawn, roosters crow, bakers stoke ovens, miller turns wheel, merchants stir. Watch ends its beat, returning to guardhouse tired but satisfied. Captain logs night's events, fines issued, fires doused, drunks cooled. They hand keys to day gatekeeper and slip home as sun gilds tiles. Town wakes safe because unseen eyes kept dark at bay. So when you picture medieval night, see not only shadow and fear, see lantern glow weaving through mist, boots steady on cobble, quiet voices warning, comforting, commanding. The watch and night patrol were thin but vital line between rest and ruin. Ordinary men keeping extraordinary faith with their sleeping neighbours. First summons came with the tolling of the great bell, subtle as a hammer in a wash basin, as ever. Its deep, slow notes rolled across the valley, waking cottagers and shepherds, echoing in the timbered streets of the town. In the fields, men straightened from their work. In the small alehouse, tankards were set down mid-drink, a rare mercy to the table. Everyone knew the meaning. The Lord was calling his levy. The muster of arms would begin at dawn on the green below the castle. That evening was full of quiet stir. In cottages and crofts, fathers took down spears long stored above hearths carefully, as if the cobwebs were official seals. Sons tried on old belts and bent under the weight of dented helmets that had clearly seen action, mostly against cupboards. Wives mended worn gambesons, stuffing extra rags into gaps where padding had thinned, turning yesterday's scraps into today's courage. The blacksmith's forge glowed late, ringing with hurried work as axe heads were tightened and horseshoes replaced. Dogs barked at the clatter, uneasy with the strange mood in the air, then settled when nothing demanded chasing but nerves. No one spoke loudly. Though it was honour to serve, it was also fear. Few in the levy were seasoned men-at-arms. Most were farmers, craftsmen, shepherds, heroes of wheat and wool. Some had fought before, but many had not. They looked at the sky and at their children with a quiet gravity, weighing duty against danger, and finding the scales unhelpfully even. Still, the summons could not be ignored. The law and the bonds of service bound them, as tightly as any strap they buckled that night. At first light the town green filled with men. Some came on foot with staves or spears, others led small nags or sturdy plough horses, who did not remember volunteering. A few better-off yeomen bore swords or crossbows. Most wore rough padded jacks or thick wool, with helms of iron or leather, fashionable if one's taste ran to weatherproof bucket. They gathered in clusters, cousins together, neighbours murmuring, guildsmen helping each other strap on mismatched bits of mail. Women and children followed, carrying bundles and watching with solemn eyes that knew more than they said. The steward of the castle rode down early to take account. He was a stern man, mounted on a grey horse, with a clerk beside him holding a roll of names and an expression learned from long acquaintance with spelling. As each man presented himself, the clerk marked the tally. Weapons were inspected. A bent spear might be exchanged for a sound one from the armoury's store, which was both generous and slightly judgmental. The steward spoke little, only nodding approval or frowning at poor gear. He knew many by name and greeted them with brief, steady words that landed like handshakes. Beside the steward stood the captain of the guard, a veteran with scars and calm bearing. His eye was sharp but not unkind, sort of gaze that tightened a strap from across the field. He showed a lad how to tie his sword belt properly, adjusted the straps on a farmer's borrowed breastplate, and spoke quietly to a frightened boy of 16 until the lad stood straighter. The captain understood fear. He had seen it before many times, and knew it behaved better when spoken to gently. As the sun climbed, the green grew busier. Pages brought barrels of ale and bread from the castle kitchens for those waiting their turn. No feast, but bravery rises nicely on yeast. Horses stamped and blew clouds of breath into the cool air. Children darted about until mothers caught them and drew them close, the world briefly arranged by a hand on a shoulder. Old men stood watching, silent and grave. The clang of hammers still rang from the blacksmith's shed nearby as last-minute repairs were made, the metal learning its lines at the edge of the stage. At mid-morning the Lord himself appeared. He rode out from the castle gate in mail and surcoat, his banner trailing behind, accompanied by knights and squires who had perfected the art of looking solemnly useful. The crowd fell silent and bowed or doffed caps. He dismounted, speaking first to the steward, then turning to his people. His words were simple. The cause just, the levy needed, courage honoured, no poetry, which was a kind of respect. He promised fair pay, protection for families left behind, and prayers said at the chapel. His voice was steady, and though fear did not vanish, men seemed to stand taller as he spoke, like spears reminded of their purpose. After the address, the muster became more ordered. Men were grouped into companies under chosen leaders, older soldiers or trusted reeves, the ones who could count without losing their place. Each company was counted and supplied. Spears where needed, bundles of arrows, spare bowstrings, leather water flasks. The castle's armoury contributed what it could, though gear was never enough for all. Somehow, there was always one helmet short and one strap too long. Still, a sense of readiness began to grow, steady as a drumbeat no one had to strike. Near the edge of the green stood the chaplain with a small altar hastily set up. Men drifted there in twos and threes to kneel and receive blessing. He spoke to each in turn, hearing quick confessions, anointing foreheads with holy oil, and murmuring prayers for safety and courage. Some rose with eyes shining, others still grave but steadier. The sound of his quiet Latin carried faintly through the hubbub, half lullaby, half lifeline. By noon, the levy looked more like an army. Banners had been brought out, simple flags for each company, often marked with little more than a colour or a crude symbol so men could find their place in the press of battle. The captain drilled them gently. How to stand in line, how to brace spears, how to keep shields locked together, also how not to argue with a horn. It was rough and imperfect, but it built a little confidence and gave shape to the day's purpose, as if the green itself drew straighter lines. Families lingered at the edges, offering food or tightening straps one last tie. Wives tied charms to their husbands' arms, a bit of ribbon, a small saint's medal, a braid of hair, light things, heavy with intent. Mothers kissed sons with quiet fierceness. Children clung and cried until lifted high for a last hug, a view of bravery from safe altitude. These goodbyes were done without wailing. The people knew war was part of life, but each parting carried weight that hung from the heart like iron. As afternoon waned, the steward gave the signal to prepare for departure. Supplies were loaded onto wagons, sacks of grain, barrels of ale, spare weapons, everything you might need, except certainty. The smith hammered a final rivet into a helm before handing it off to its owner, who promised it a careful life. The lord mounted his horse, as did his knights, while the footmen gathered under their banners. The captain walked among them, offering last bits of advice. Keep close, mind the signal horn, trust the man at your side. wisdom in short sentences. The chaplain moved once more among the ranks, sprinkling holy water, murmuring blessings. Some men knelt briefly, others bowed their heads without moving. The setting sun cast long shadows across the green, turning the spears into a small forest of dark points, trees that would not root where they stood. The air felt heavy with unspoken thoughts, fear, pride, duty, and the quiet hope of return, folded and tucked away like letters. At last the horn sounded, the drawbridge was lowered, and the first company stepped off the green toward the road. Boots thudded on packed earth, hooves clattered behind as the lord and his knights took the lead. Wagons creaked under their loads, families waved until the column was nearly out of sight, then turned back to the work of waiting, which is a craft of its own. The green emptied slowly, leaving only trampled grass and a few stray feathers from the geese that had wandered earlier in the day, critics without credentials. When the last soldier was gone and dusk had fallen, the steward closed his roll of names and gave it to a page for safekeeping, the day reduced to ink and fibres. The blacksmith banked his fire and shut the forge. The chaplain lingered to pray briefly for those who had departed. In the distance, the fading sound of the marching column echoed faintly, before it was swallowed by the hills, like a story finishing its own sentence. The castle gates closed at nightfall. Inside, the keep returned to its quiet rhythms, supper in the hall, candles in the windows, yet all knew the levy was gone. In cottages and farmsteads, beds felt emptier, prayers were said with extra fervour. The muster of arms was over, and the long waiting had begun, gentle as a tide and just as patient. As dusk began to settle over the castle town, a single bell rang from the watchtower above the gatehouse. Its slow, deliberate toll signalled the change of guard and the coming of night. In the square below, tradesmen hurried to close their shutters. The last market stalls packed up with a rattle of boards and barrels. Through the gathering shadows walked the captain of the watch, his cloak dark against the fading light, his boots striking a steady rhythm on the cobbles, the metronome of safety. He was a man of middle years, scarred and calm-eyed, with the quiet authority of one long used to danger. His sword hung at his hip, but he rarely touched it. His voice and presence were weapon enough. Behind him followed two sergeants, lanterns unlit for now, their hands resting easy on spear shafts. Together they crossed the square, stopping now and then to speak with merchants or nod to townsfolk heading home. The captive's first duty each evening was the tour of the gates. He climbed the worn stone stair to the parapet above the great oak doors, where the guards stood ready. There he spoke with the day watch, asking what travellers had passed, if any quarrels had arisen, if news had come from the roads. His questions were quiet but precise. Nothing escaped his notice. Then he inspected the portcullis and drawbridge chains, tested the lock of the postern gate, and peered out at the dim road beyond. Next he visited the wall towers, their narrow stairs echoing with his measured tread. In each he checked the brazier for warmth, the horn for signalling alarm, the state of the crossbows and stones kept for defence. He praised a clean and ready post, frowned at a lantern left untrimmed, and spoke a word of encouragement to young watchmen nervous in their first night duty. Where fear lingered, his calm steadiness seemed to banish it, like a hand smoothing wrinkled linen. When his circuit of the walls was complete, the captain returned to the watch barracks near the gate. Here men gathered to hear the knight's orders. Some were veterans, easy in their armour, others green-faced lads hoping to impress. The captain spoke simply, where each patrol would walk, which taverns to watch for trouble, which roads to keep clear for late merchants. He reminded them to help townsfolk first, to keep swords sheathed unless need demanded, and to bring prisoners unharmed if they could, courage with manners. Then the watch dispersed. Lanterns were lit, casting warm circles on the darkening streets. Pairs of guards set off in measured rhythm, their boots echoing against the timbered houses. The captain did not always lead a patrol himself, but tonight he chose to walk with one through the busier quarter near the river. It was a place of taverns and warehouses, where labourers drank and sailors brawled when pay was good. The streets there smelled of ale and fish, of smoke from hearth fires and the river's damp breath. Taverns spilled lamplight and laughter onto the cobbles. The captain walked steadily, greeting barkeeps by name, listening for the pitch of voices that meant quarrel or danger. When he saw a drunken pair begin to shove, he stepped forward with calm authority. His sergeant stayed close, but often his voice alone was enough to cool tempers. "Go home," he said quietly, and they did. Economy of force in a single sentence. Now and then he stopped to question strangers, merchants still unloading, sailors seeking lodging, travellers with packs and road-wearied faces. His manner was firm but fair. Most answered readily, glad for safety under his watch. Those who bristled at his questions met an unflinching gaze that needed no drawn sword. Later in the night, a runner came breathless with word of theft in the upper town. The captain turned at once, striding swiftly with his men. At a merchant's house they found a window pried and goods gone. He examined the marks of the crowbar, questioned neighbours gently but thoroughly, and set 2 guards to search the lanes for suspicious figures. Calm and methodical, he comforted the anxious merchant and promised fair pursuit, which is the best kind. Sometimes the watch faced darker matters, a body found in an alley, a brawl turned deadly, or whispers of spies. Then the captain's tone hardened but remained steady. He called for torches, examined signs with a soldier's eye, and sent trusted men to fetch the steward or the Lord's bailiff. Justice here was deliberate, not hasty, and the captain kept it so, save when anger rose among the townsfolk. Toward midnight the streets grew still. Doors and shutters were closed, taverns quieted, only the soft glow of lanterns marking the patrols. The captain returned to the gatehouse to check on the outer watch. Together they drank a little warmed ale, spoke softly of the day's small troubles, and listened to the night sounds, the river lapping against pilings, an owl's call, the faint bark of a distant dog. Sometimes he walked the silent lanes alone, lantern swinging. He knew every alley and court, every place where shadows lingered. He walked not as a hunter but as a guardian, trusting the peace his presence brought. Few dared mischief when the captain's boots sounded on the stones, a sermon preached in leather soles. Before dawn he made one final round. The night watch, weary but proud, greeted him as he passed. He thanked them, quietly, but the words carried weight, and noted any trouble for the steward's morning report. Then he returned to the barracks just as the first pale light touched the roofs. When the day guard came yawning to relieve the night watch, the captain met them at the gate. He gave his orders, spoke of the night's events, and handed over the keys and the rolled reports. Then, at last, he allowed himself a slow breath. Another night had passed without riot or ruin, and the town under the castle slept safe through his vigilance. Though his work held danger and long hours, the captain of the watch took no pride in fear. His craft was quiet safety, a steady eye, a calm word, a sword drawn only when all else failed. As the sun rose and townsfolk stepped out to sweep doorsteps and open shops, few gave thought to the man who had walked their streets in darkness. Yet it was his unseen watch that kept peace through the long medieval night. The morning of the trial broke pale and cool, a thin mist curling above the castle yard, as if the weather too preferred not to take sides. Word had gone out the night before, and by dawn folk from the town and nearby hamlets gathered to watch. Trials were solemn and rare. Most quarrels ended in fines or oaths, but some matters, grave crimes or questions of honour, were left to God's judgment by combat. Today 2 men would meet in the yard to prove truth with steel, an argument conducted at sword volume for the benefit of any soul who found logic overrated. The ground had been swept and levelled, sand was strewn to hide the mud and, incidentally, the future, and a rough barrier of timber rails marked the combat ring. At one end stood a small platform for the lord and his household, at the other a raised seat for the steward and scribes who would witness the oaths and, if necessary, explain them later with a straight face. Along the rails townsfolk clustered, murmuring softly, faces pale with awe and curiosity. A few children clung to mothers' skirts, eyes wide, already composing very thorough questions for bedtime. Before the combatants arrived, priests processed into the yard. They bore a crucifix and holy water, their voices low in prayer, as ritual kindly went first. The chapel bell tolled 3 slow notes, calling all to silence and good behaviour. The Lord emerged then, wrapped in a long fur-lined cloak against the chill, and took his place on the platform. Knights stood behind him, helms in hand, faces grave. This was no tourney for sport, this was justice, which employs fewer ribbons and smiles. The accused came first. He was a broad-shouldered man, a miller by trade, his face set and pale beneath his cap. Chains had been struck from his wrists but still hung loose about his belt, a memory with hardware. He walked with 2 guards at his side, head held stiffly, eyes fixed on the sand ahead. Behind him followed his kin, grim and silent. He knelt briefly before the Lord's seat, a courtesy to hierarchy and, perhaps, to luck, then stepped into the ring. Opposite him entered the accuser, a knight of middling years, lean and stern. His surcoat bore his household arms, and he carried his own sword and shield, the sort of accessories that insist one is telling the truth. He bowed deeply to the Lord and then to the priests before taking his place at the other end of the ring. His face was unreadable, his manner calm but intent, the expression men wear when they are certain and would prefer events to keep up. The herald stepped forward, unrolling a parchment that had clearly practiced being important. In a clear voice he proclaimed the matter, an accusation of murder, denied by the accused, demanded trial by combat according to ancient rite. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, quickly hushed. When the herald finished, the chaplain raised his crucifix high, and both men knelt to swear their oaths. Each declared his cause just, and called upon God to grant victory to the innocent, a request notable for its popularity on both sides. Then came the arming. The knight was already dressed in padded gambeson and mail. He strapped on his helm and lifted his shield with practised ease, which is to say with the air of someone who has put on this argument before. The miller wore only a thickly quilted jack and leather cap, his weapon a stout mace provided by the steward, practical, honest, and unlikely to be mistaken for poetry. Both tested their grips and stood ready. The chaplain sprinkled them with holy water. The steward checked that each weapon was sound. The air grew tense and very still, like a held breath deciding to be fair. The Lord rose and lifted his hand. "Let God decide," he said, voice carrying over the yard with the calm of a man not personally required to fight. The herald blew his horn once, long and low. With that, the combat began, and the yard remembered how loud faith can be when metal helps it speak. At first the 2 circled, cautious. The knight held his sword high and shield close. The miller gripped his mace in both hands, eyes darting for an opening that would kindly open itself. The crowd hardly breathed. Then, with a sudden cry, the knight struck, his blade flashing toward the miller's shoulder. The mace swung up in tide to block, the blow glancing off with a dull thud. Sand sprayed under their boots as they closed and broke apart again, a conversation in short, emphatic sentences. Blow followed blow, slow and heavy. This was no swift joust, but a grueling trial, fought by men with fear and faith alike in their hearts, both of which are notably heavy when worn under armour. The knight pressed with skill, his sword ringing against the miller's mace and padded coat. The miller, though untrained, fought with raw strength, his great swings forcing the knight back more than once. Each strike drew gasps from the watching crowd, who were suddenly experts in footwork and very grateful not to be demonstrating it. Between bouts they circled, panting, weapons lowered for a heartbeat. Sweat streaked the miller's face despite the chill. The knight's mail glinted dull where sand clung to it like an opinion. Both glanced toward the crucifix, silent prayers flashing across tired faces. The chaplain murmured softly from the rail, though his words were lost in the wind and arguably not addressed to the wind anyway. At last the fight turned. The knight feinted left and swung right, his sword catching the edge of the miller's cap and cutting deep into his brow. Blood ran down the man's face as he staggered back, proving that red indeed reads from a distance. Still he fought on, roaring with desperate strength, his mace smashing against the knight's shield with a sound like splitting wood and stubbornness. But the knight pressed harder, steady and relentless, driving him step by step across the sand the way patience drives any argument it intends to win. With a final cry, the miller stumbled. The knight's sword struck true, knocking the mace from his grasp and sending him sprawling. The field went silent but for his ragged breath, the kind of silence that knows exactly what it means. The knight stood over him, blade poised. Then he stepped back and raised the sword to the Lord in salute, a reminder that ceremony never misses a chance, even when everyone is tired. The herald's horn sounded again, short, sharp, final. The trial was ended. The chaplain hurried to the fallen man, tending the wound with cloth, and whispered prayer. The Lord spoke, his judgment quiet but firm. The knight's cause upheld, the miller guilty in the eyes of man and God. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some sorrowful, some grimly satisfied, all of them freshly aware that truth, when asked to choose a costume, sometimes reaches for steel. The defeated man, bleeding but alive, was taken into custody once more. His fate would be the Lord's to decide, often death, sometimes a fine or exile if mercy was shown, a coin tossed by conscience with many eyes watching. His kin wept softly as he was led away. The victor bowed to the Lord and then to the chapel, thanking God aloud for righteous aid. He looked weary, not joyful, a man who had fought for honour but found no pleasure in another's fall, which is the respectable part of the ceremony no one applauds. As the crowd dispersed, life crept slowly back. Merchants reopened shutters, children, now chattering, chased one another with sticks, turning a grim lesson into a game with the speed only children possess. Yet many glanced back at the sanded ring, its surface darkened by blood. The trial by combat was rare for good reason. It was hard and sobering, a thing that left the heart heavy when justice seemed clear, and especially when it didn't. When the yard emptied, servants raked fresh sand over the marks and washed blood from the rails, housekeeping for history. The crucifix was carried back to the chapel. The herald rolled his scroll and departed with the gravity of a man whose punctuation has consequences. Only the echo of the fight lingered, a memory in the stones and in the hearts of those who had watched, the kind of echo that answers if you call it, and sometimes when you don't. By dusk the place was quiet again, the castle resuming its ordinary life. Yet in every hearthside tale that night the trial was spoken of, the fear, the prayers, the clash of weapons, and the heavy truth that sometimes justice wears a soldier's face and leaves a scar behind. And so the yard slept, the sand smoothed, the rails clean, while memory kept its watch, economical, precise, and in no hurry to forget. On the far side of the town, just beyond the last row of cottages, there was a small field known to all. It was a quiet place most days, grass growing long, birds picking among the hedges, but its name carried a weight that hushed voices. The execution green. When justice reached its hardest edge, when theft, treason, or murder had met its end in the Lord's court, it was here that the sentence was carried out. A field, yes, but also a black-letter footnote to the town's soul, where the law spoke in the shortest possible sentences. At dawn on the appointed day, the town stirred early. People rose not with joy, but with a sombre curiosity. Because I'd rather not see wrestled famously poorly with, but what if I miss it? Merchants shuttered their shops, or left apprentices to mind them and experiment in trust, with mixed historical results. Farmers on their way to the fields paused to speak of the coming judgment in a tone that tried to be brisk and landed nearer to careful. By mid-morning a slow stream of townsfolk and villagers moved toward the green, quiet and respectful, as if the grass itself had asked for lower voices. The scaffold had been built the day before. Carpenters worked under the captain of the guard's watch, raising stout beams and testing the trapdoor with ropes and pegs, and the sort of attention normally reserved for bridges and confessions. For a hanging there would be a gallows. For a beheading, a low wooden block, and sometimes both, if judgment was uncertain until the last. Versatility is a virtue, hear. A simple rail kept the crowd back. Beyond it stood a space for the Lord's men, priests and heralds. A small geometry of authority arranged so no one need ask who spoke for the law. Before the hour, priests came to bless the place. They sprinkled holy water on the scaffold, murmuring prayers that justice is tempered with mercy, and that the soul of the condemned might find peace. Incense drifted, doing what incense does best, making even rough boards seem part of a ritual older than the timber. Their quiet voices and the faint resinous scent lent the green a strange, hushed air. Birds sang faintly in the hedgerow, stubbornly on schedule, unaware or uninterested in the human weight gathering there. The crowd gathered slowly, men in work clothes, women with shawls pulled tight, children kept close but not always shielded, curiosity being a stronger leash than hands. Some came from duty, some from curiosity, a few from personal grief or anger that made the air around them taut. All stood quietly, speaking in low voices. This was no fair or feast, it was the law made visible, and even those who had no love for the Lord felt its solemnity wrap around their throats like a caution. Then came the procession. From the town gate emerged the captain of the guard, riding slowly at the head of a file of soldiers whose boots had opinions about gravel. Behind them walked the condemned. Some came silently, heads bowed. Others prayed aloud or called out to the crowd with voices that tried for steady and reached the edge of breaking. Shackles clinked with each step, a music that never found a tune. The priest walked close, holding a crucifix and murmuring prayers. Sometimes family followed, weeping softly. Sometimes no one did, and the silence said its own familiar, terrible lines. When they reached the scaffold, the herald stepped forward to read the sentence. His voice was clear and formal, naming the crime and the judgment, the words ironed flat by tradition so that no one imagined this was improvisation. He spoke not with hatred, but with ritual weight, each word part of a long chain meant to show that this act belonged to the law, not to vengeance. Though vengeance, ever helpful, liked to stand nearby pretending to be a cousin. The crowd listened in silence, broken only by the sigh of the wind and a nervous cough that regretted itself immediately. If there were final words, they came now. Some condemned spoke fiercely, proclaiming innocence or cursing enemies with a fluency that would have impressed on any other stage. Others asked forgiveness or whispered prayers. A few stood mute, eyes fixed far beyond the gathered faces, as if measuring a horizon they alone could see. The priest stayed close, offering comfort, the crucifix lifted for the last glance of faith. Mercy, for its part, showed that as requested, if it always as expected. Then came the end. For hanging, the noose was placed, the rope checked with the peculiar care reserved for knots and fates. For beheading, the condemned was guided to kneel at the block, the grain of the wood strangely interesting at close range. Soldiers held fur but not cruelly. The captain gave a small nod when all was ready, quiet punctuation of command. A hush deeper than any church fell over the green. Then, swift, decisive act was done. Justice, when it moves, does not meander. A collective breath passed through the crowd, some gasping, some crossing themselves, a few staring at their boots as if the leather had suddenly become instructive. The priest prayed over the body, blessing the soul's journey with words that tried to mend what hands had just unmade. The herald declared the law fulfilled. Slowly, people turned away, faces thoughtful and quiet. There was little cheering here. The stomach knows what the mind insists upon. Necessary is this the same as easy. Afterward, the scaffold might stand for a day or two, a silent warning, before carpenters came to dismantle it plank by plank, as if unbuilding a sentence. The body, if it claimed by kin, was taken for burial beyond consecrated ground. The grave-digger, philosopher by default, did his work with practiced care. The green returned to stillness, grass growing once more over the place where life had ended. Yet for a tithe, those who had watched would pass by with lowered gaze, discovering new routes that were, inconveniently, longer. Children asked quiet questions that night, parents answered with care and a sudden respect for simple words. Farmers spoke of the Lord's justice, merchants of the need for order, though few spoke with ease. In the alehouse there was murmured talk of guilt, of mercy, of the frailty of all men, and a general agreement that everyone would prefer fewer such days, ideally starting now. Such a day reminded even the boldest that law was real and its edge sharp, and that gossip, for once, could take the evening off. The captive of the guard, after all was done, walked the green alone to ensure order. He checked the scaffold, saw to the guard, and then rode slowly back to the castle. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were tired in that particular way officers learn. The weight of duty carried without audience, the quiet arithmetic of lives and laws. Justice was his duty, yes, but he bore its stones in silence. By nightfall the town resumed its life. Fires were lit, suppers eaten, songs sung softly in a few taverns where the lutes had the good sense to choose gentle keys. Yet beneath it all lingered a quiet sobriety. The execution had been seen and witnessed. The law stood firm. Life went on, but a shadow of solemnity moved with it, a reminder of how thin the line could be between freedom and the rope or the block, a line most people preferred not to test for tensile strength. The green itself lay silent under the moon. Only the empty scaffold creaked faintly in the night breeze, a lonely sentinel to the day's grim work. In Ain it too would vanish, leaving nothing but grass and memory, which is to say everything. But the people would remember, as they always did, long after the morning fog had hidden the last footprints from sight, because forgetting is easy for places, and harder for those who stood there when the world held its breath. Beneath the castle, far below the echo of the great hall and the warmth of hearths, lay the dungeon. Few went there willingly, clearly the marketing never quite took. Its stair began behind a thick oaken door banded with iron, a door most passed without thought, though all knew what lay beyond. Down the winding steps the air cooled and grew damp, carrying a scent of stone, moss, and rusted metal, the house blend. A single lantern, swinging from an iron hook, lit the descent with wavering yellow that did nothing for the decor and everything for the nerves. The keeper of the dungeon lived above its door in a narrow chamber, simple and spare. He was an older man with quiet eyes, neither cruel nor kind, simply patient in the work that had been his for decades, the very portrait of "this is fine" rendered in wool and keys. At dawn he woke, lit his lantern, and went below to check his charges. He moved with slow, measured steps, his keys clinking softly at his belt. The dungeon was not a place for haste. It had all the time in the world, and then a little more. At the foot of the stair stretched a passage of rough stone, arched and low. The walls sweated moisture. The floor was cold underfoot, as if the hill itself had decided to be unsociable. Doors of heavy oak lined the corridor, each bound with iron and pierced with a tiny grating through which air and light could enter, and hope, regrettably, could peer in and think better of it. Beyond them lay small cells, straw on the floor, a jug of water, a low wooden stool or none at all. The dungeon was meant to hold, not to comfort. It excelled at least one of those. The keeper's first task each morning was to check every door. He pressed his weight against the great bolts, tested the locks with his ring of keys, and spoke a low word to any prisoner within. Some answered politely, some cursed or begged. He met each with the same Seven voice, customer service, Stone Age edition. Then he made his round with a bucket of water and a basket of coarse bread. Each prisoner received his ration through the narrow hatch, enough to live, never more. It was the sort of diet that made a man philosophical, and not in a cheerful way. By mid-morning the place had warmed slightly from the world above, though no true light reached here. The only glow came from the keeper's lantern and a few small oil lamps set in iron brackets along the wall. Shadows clung to the corners like tenants who had lost the lease but refused to move. The air smelled of damp straw, stone, and tallow smoke. Rats sometimes skittered, but then they moved quietly, aware of the hush, professionals respecting professionals. The dungeon held many kinds of souls. There were petty thieves awaiting judgment, poachers caught in the Lord's forest, drunken brawlers cooling their tempers. Sometimes a captured spy or a rebel noble would be lodged in the deeper cells, chained and guarded day and night. Each had his story, whispered or shouted through the grating, a library of unreliable narrators. The keeper listened rarely. It was not his place to weigh truth. He was there to keep, not to judge, and he performed that calling with the kind of modest pride usually reserved for well-swept thresholds and properly counted spoons. From time to time the steward descended, brisk and efficient, to speak with a prisoner or deliver orders from the Lord. Guards might come too, clanking and laughing uneasily, to fetch a man for questioning or release. Nobody jokes quite as loudly as someone who very much hopes never to be on the other side of the door. The chaplain sometimes visited, bringing quiet words and prayer to those who would hear him. His lantern light and murmured Latin made the dark seem briefly less heavy, like a hand on a shoulder that did not promise rescue, but did insist on courage. The cells nearest the stair were for short stays. Farther down the passage, past a second door thick with iron, lay the long-term keeps, colder, narrower, with chains fixed into the stone. Here the air was bitter with damp, and silence deeper, as if sound itself had decided to winter elsewhere. The keeper disliked this part, but tended it dutifully, checking each chain and lock. If a fire burned in the great hall above, no warmth touched these walls. News of comfort travelled slowly and often lost its way. In the middle of the day the keeper paused to eat a small meal by the stair, bread, cheese, perhaps a bit of broth brought by a boy from the kitchens. He sat with his lantern beside him, listening to the muffled sounds of the castle far above, faint echoes of hammers, bells, and sometimes laughter drifting down the spiral like postcards from another country. Here, life moved at another pace, slow and watchful, and the clock was a drumbeat of water in the stone. Sometimes a new prisoner arrived, then the dungeon stirred with sudden noise. Boots on stone, orders shouted, a man protesting or weeping, the usual musical. The keeper would step aside as guards led the captive past, then follow to bolt the door once it closed. The air would be thick with the scent of fear and sweat, and for hours the hall might echo with cries until quiet returned, bringing with it that solemn companionship of stone and straw. On rare days the dungeon held someone of rank. Then candles were lit in the upper cells and special care was taken. Better straw, a stool, perhaps writing tools, luxury, in the modest way that only a basement can attempt. Such guests were guarded firmly but with courtesy. Politics played their games even here, and everyone remembered that ransoms travel faster when the ink is legible. The keeper knew to say little, to move with bowed head and keep the lantern steady. By afternoon the dungeon fell silent again. Prisoners slept or brooded, their voices stilled by the weight of stone. The keeper mended what needed mending, straps for shackles, a broken lock, the rope of the bucket lowered into the well. He swept the passage, though the damp never let it stay truly clean. Tidiness in theory, mildew in practice. His was a craft of maintenance, patient and invisible, the sort that prevents catastrophe and receives precisely no applause. Toward evening came the second round of water and bread. The keeper carried his lantern from cell to cell, setting it down to open each hatch. Some prisoners muttered thanks, others stared blankly. A few begged for news of the world above. Was there a feast? Had judgment been passed? He answered with the barest facts, kind but distant truth carefully portioned, like everything else down here. It was easier that way and safer for hearts that must be steady tomorrow. When night fell, the dungeon grew colder. Moisture gathered on the stones and the air turned still. Above, the castle feasted or slept. Below, only the keeper and his lantern moved, a tiny sun with a very small solar system. He made one last round, checking every bolt and lock, banking the tiny fires in the brazier by the stair. Then he climbed slowly upward, leaving the dark behind. The prisoners settled to uneasy sleep, their breathing and the faint ruster of straw the only sound, a choir that hoped not to be noticed. Sometimes, in deepest night, a horn would sound, or boots would thunder on the stair. Then the dungeon woke abruptly, a new captive, a midnight judgment, an urgent message from the Lord. The keeper roused himself and obeyed. Habit is a better alarm than bells. But most nights passed in quiet, the silence broken only by the distant drip of water and the sigh of sleepers, the lullaby of consequences. At dawn the pattern began anew. The keeper returned with lantern and keys, faithful as the turning of the seasons. He found each cell as it should be, each prisoner present and alive. Bread and water were passed, straw changed where needed, locks tested. Life here was narrow but steady, an unseen foundation of the castle's power. Glamorous, not sung about, but astonishingly reliable, which is why power trusts it. Above, men feasted, judged, and rode to war. The day of court dawned cold and pale over the castle. Mist clung to the moat and drifted across the cobbled yard, blurring the shapes of men and beasts already at work. The mist, ever helpful, prefers its judgment softened at the edges. Beyond the high outer gate, villagers gathered in the chill, waiting for permission to enter and present their petitions. Within the walls the great tower loomed, its narrow windows dark against the dawn, and from its crown a single banner stirred in the early breeze, because nothing says authority like fabric catching a draught. Inside, the great hall was already stirring to life, though the Lord had not yet appeared. Power is very punctual about letting others die early. Servants moved in measured silence, sweeping yesterday's rushes and scattering new ones laced with mint and dried marigold. The long trestle tables that had stood for supper were carried aside. Today the hall must be clear for the business of rule. At the far end the dais was prepared with solemn care. A high-backed chair carved with lions' heads was drawn forward and draped with a heavy cloth of red and gold, subtlety taking the morning off. At its side a smaller seat awaited the lady of the castle, and a narrow lectern was set for the steward who would read the rolls of law, a man and his paperwork, a tale as old as ink. The fire on the hearth was coaxed into brightness, its light catching the polished iron of candle stands and the brass studs of the Lord's chair. Pages hurried with cushions and stools for visiting knights and clerks, because comfort lends courage to opinions. The steward himself arrived before sunrise, thin and brisk, his bundle of scrolls hugged to his chest, his keys clinking as he strode to the dais. He oversaw everything, muttering now and then to the beadle, who would keep order among the crowd. Translation: remind enthusiasm, it has boundaries. As the first bells of the day rang from the chapel tower, the hall began to fill. Men-at-arms took their places along the walls, halberds upright, eyes keen decorative columns that stare back. A scribe spread his inks and sharpened quills at a low table to one side. The chaplain entered, grave in dark robe and white collar, and took his place near the Lord's chair to advise on oaths and matters of conscience, a necessary accessory when truth needs a referee. Courtiers and household knights followed, each nodding to the steward before taking position. The hum of voices grew, but never too loud. This was a solemn day, and even gossip wore its better shoes. Then the great oak doors swung wide. The Lord entered slowly, his cloak trimmed with fur against the morning chill, his sword at his hip but peaceably sheathed it enjoys the scenery. Behind him came the lady, serene and watchful, a long veil trailing from her headdress. Pages hurried ahead to light fresh candles on the dais. The crowd bent low as the pair mounted the steps and took their seats. The chaplain murmured a blessing. The steward lifted his staff and called the hall to order, ancient ritual by which noise learns manners. The first petitioner stepped forward, a farmer, hat in hand, face worn by sun and weather. He bowed deeply before speaking, his words simple and halting, as he told of a neighbour's ox straying into his barley and ruining the young crop. The steward read from a scroll the custom of the region. The Lord leaned forward, asking quiet questions, while the lady whispered a suggestion at his side: domestic diplomacy, fluent in consequences. At last the judgment was given. The neighbour must pay in grain at harvest. The farmer bowed again and backed away, relief on his face, priceless harvest of being heard. Next came a merchant, robes fine but voice edged with worry. Bandits on the forest road, he said, had stolen a wagon of cloth. The Lord's brow furrowed. He questioned the merchant carefully, learning the place and hour of attack. Then he turned to his captain of the guard, who stepped forward, saluted, and promised a mounted patrol before week's end. Bandits hate punctuality. The scribe wrote swiftly, quill scratching a small storm. The merchant bowed and withdrew, a little straighter now, prophet being quite fond of security. One by one they came, millers disputing rights to the stream, widows asking for relief from tax, craftsmen protesting unfair tolls at the gate. Some matters were small and swiftly judged, others roused long debate. No subject is too tiny to become enormous when money is nearby. The chaplain reminded the hall of the law of sanctuary and the charity due to the poor. The steward cross-checked the castle's rolls to ensure no ruling would breach long-held custom. Parchment, too, has memory. The lady listened keenly, speaking softly to the Lord when mercy might soften a stern decree. She is the hinge on which severity learns to swing. Sometimes the mood grew tense. A poacher was brought in under guard, his hands bound. A gaunt rabbit dangling from his belt as proof exhibits A and B respectively, hunger and habit. The man knelt, pale with fear, as the Lord questioned him. The chaplain spoke of trespass and repentance, the captain of the guard of duty to the forest law. At last the Lord spared the man's life but fined him harshly and ordered him to serve a month at the kennels. The hall let out a breath as the poacher was led away, alive but chastened, justice choosing the whip instead of the sword for once. By mid-morning the doors opened again to admit envoys from a nearby manor. They carried letters sealed with wax requesting arbitration in a boundary dispute. 2 fields, 1 line, infinite opinions. The steward read the letters aloud in a clear voice while the lord and lady conferred. A map was brought forth, its edges curled and worn, showing streams and copses, meadows and mill. Knights craned to see. After long debate, the Lord deferred judgment until witnesses could be called. He would send riders to walk the land. Such matters, he knew, could not be rushed. Lines drawn in haste have a talent for becoming battlefields. All this while the hall hummed with quiet life. Dogs nosed through the rushes for crumbs, the original auditors. Pages ran messages to the kitchens for bread and ale to refresh the company. Now and then a servant stoked the fire, sending sparks whirling into the smoky light, tiny suns petitioning the rafters. Outside the windows the mist lifted, showing a bright cold sky. Bells rang again from the chapel, marking the passage of the morning time filing its report. At last the steward tapped his staff and called the final cases. A pair of young men came to swear fealty, kneeling before the Lord with hands clasped. The chaplain blessed their oaths, the lady smiled gently as each rose, new vassals bound by promise ambition's favourite knot. Then came a travelling minstrel to ask leave to perform at the evening meal. The Lord granted it with a nod, and the hall relaxed, glad for the promise of song after such sober hours. Policy pairs well with melody. When the last petitioner had gone, the Lord stood. The men-at-arms struck their halberds once upon the floor, a sharp echo that silenced the hall. Nothing persuades quiet like metal hitting stone. The chaplain spoke a short prayer, commending the judgments given and asking for wisdom in their keeping. Then the Lord descended the dais and left through the side passage to his private chambers, the lady following with a glance backward at the assembled household, one last stitch to keep the day from unravelling. Slowly the tension drained from the room. The steward gathered his scrolls and keys, speaking quietly with the scribe. Men-at-arms returned to their posts on the walls. Courtiers clustered to discuss the morning's decisions, editing events into anecdotes at remarkable speed. The great hall, so solemn moments before, shifted again toward ordinary life. Soon servants would bring trestle tables back for the noon meal. Soon the clang of dishes and chatter of pages would replace the hush of judgment-proof that governance, like appetite, keeps regular hours. But for a time the air still held the weight of what had passed. Here in this hall, under banners faded by smoke and years, lives had been shaped. Fields secured, taxes lifted, punishments given, oaths sworn. The Lord's power had shown itself not in sword alone, but in measured word. In justice seen and heard by all, spectacle has its uses. Fairness more low. The lady's quiet counsel and the chaplain's grave advice had tempered it, and the steward's records would make it lasting, ink doing what steel cannot. Outside the great doors the petitioners dispersed, some relieved, some muttering, some smiling through tears. They crossed the drawbridge into the cold bright day, returning to farms and shops with news to share. Word of the court's rulings would spread by evening, carried in taverns and market stalls, shaping the life of the lands around the castle, policy travelling at the speed of bread and ale. Inside, the hall breathed again. Smoke curled from the hearth, mingling with the scents of rushes and tallow. A boy swept away footprints from the morning's crowd. A dog stretched and yawned in the warmth, a professional in the field of morale. Soon this place would echo with laughter and music, with the clatter of trenchers and the hum of feast. But just now it was still, and in that stillness the memory of justice lingered like the fading echo of a bell, quiet, exact, and impossible to pretend you didn't hear. At the very edge of the castle's outer wall stood the Gatehouse, a squat, powerful tower built to watch the world beyond. Its great oak doors, bound with iron, were the mouth of the castle, and not the smiling kind. Here every traveller, merchant and pilgrim passed. Here guards kept wary eyes on the road, and watchmen called to one another across battlements. The Gatehouse was both welcome and warning, a threshold where peace could turn to defence in the beat of a heart faster if you forget your papers. Before dawn the watch changed. The night guards, stiff with cold, stamped their boots on the stone as they waited for relief. Above, in the narrow chamber of the upper gate, a brazier burned low, casting a red glow on faces shadowed by helms fashioned to intimidating and coincidentally terrible for peripheral vision. Down below, a sleepy porter unlocked the wicket door, a small man-sized opening within the great gate, so that the day guard could file out. They came yawning and laughing softly, cloaks wrapped tight, spears glinting faintly in the dim light, which is the medieval version of coffee. The sergeant of the gate arrived next, a weathered man with sharp eyes. He examined the hinges and bolts, checked the drawbridge chains, and thumped the great oak doors with the butt of his spear to hear their solid heart. The door passed its physical. Then he unlocked the winch house. Its gears and ropes creaked as the portcullis, an iron-toothed grille, was hauled slowly upward. The sound rang deep and heavy, echoing through the cold stone the castle's morning yawn. Beyond, the outer road was empty but for morning mist curling in low folds, doing its best to look mysterious. The gatehouse itself was a small world. On one side stood the guardroom, a long low chamber with benches, weapons racks and a small hearth where a pot of broth simmered for the men, seasoned liberally with smoke and gossip. Here they played dice on quiet hours, or mended straps, or sharpened spearheads on whetstones. On the other side lay the porter's room, crowded with keys, ledgers, and the great horns used to sound alarm music but for emergencies. Stairs wound up to the parapet, where lookouts scanned the horizon with the kind of focus usually reserved for spotting rain at harvest. As dawn brightened, the day's work began. Merchants arrived first, their carts piled with barrels and bales. Each halted before the bridge while the sergeant strode out, demanding tolls and inspecting goods. Wheels rumbled across the timbers as the drawbridge groaned under weight, a helpful reminder that wood also has feelings. Some merchants complained at the fee, others paid readily, eager to sell within the safety of the walls. A clerk sat nearby, tallying coin and writing the names of those who passed, because memory is noble until it forgets who owes what. Soon came villagers with eggs and butter, woodcutters with carts of faggots, shepherds driving small flocks to market. The guards inspected for weapons and smuggled goods, though kindly enough to the familiar faces, nobody wants to arrest someone's aunt over a hidden sausage. Children ran ahead, waving to the men on the wall. Dogs sniffed at baskets and wagons, but were shooed off with gentle kicks. The gatehouse was stern, but it was also the rhythm of ordinary life, a place where the castle and its people met and mutually decided to keep civilization going for one more day. From time to time a stranger appeared, and the tone sharpened. One morning it was a wandering minstrel with lute on his back. The sergeant questioned him carefully before allowing him through. The song about taxes was, regrettably, not requested. Another day came a party of armed men in a lord's livery, not known to the garrison. The portcullis stayed down while messengers were sent to the keep. Only when permission returned from within were the strangers admitted, their swords peace-bound with cords of leather, fashionably inconvenient. The gatehouse was ready for war, as well as welcome. Above the arch hung murder holes, dark and silent now, but ready to pour boiling water or stones if ever enemies broke the bridge. Customer service policies vary by circumstance. On the battlements stood great cauldrons for pitch, racks for bows and crossbows, barrels of stones. The winch for the drawbridge was strong enough to raise it in moments, cutting the castle off from the road, social distancing, heavy architecture edition. The men drilled each week, the chains groaning as the bridge swung up and the portcullis dropped with a clang that said, quite clearly, "Office hours are over." At midday the guards ate their pottage in shifts, some remaining at watch while others sat by the hearth. Dice rattled on the table, one man mended his boots, another told tales of the forest road, all strictly accurate if you ignore the parts that weren't. The sergeant walked the parapet, scanning the horizon for dust clouds that might mean riders. Sometimes a messenger would gallop in, blowing horn and waving writs. The portcullis would rise just high enough to admit him before slamming shut again, like a very punctual jaw. The life of the gate was half boredom, half sudden alarm, and entirely allergic to complacency. One afternoon brought such alarm, a cart approached too fast, driven by men who did not halt when hailed. The sergeant roared a command. The guards braced spears. The portcullis rattled down halfway before the cart stopped in a cloud of dust. Words flew, weapons bristled. Then, slowly, tempers cooled. The men proved to be panicked peasants fleeing bandits, and they were let through with warning to slow next time speed limits, not officially posted, universally enforced. Still, the moment left the hall tense, the men's hands tight on spear shafts long after adrenaline lingers, that's its hobby. Toward evening, travellers trickled in, seeking safety before the gates shut for the night. Pilgrims dusty from the road, merchants with tired mules, a peddler with pans clanging on his back, all paid their toll and passed under the watchful eyes of the guard. Children lingered to stare up at the murder holes, laughing nervously as they imagined what might fall from them. Education through anxiety. The great winch creaked one last time to lift the portcullis for a slow wagon laden with hay, which is never in a hurry and resents the suggestion. When the sun slid behind the hills and the outer road grew shadowed, the sergeant gave his order. The portcullis came rattling down with finality, its iron teeth biting the stone. The drawbridge was hauled up inch by inch, groaning as it closed off the moat. The great oak doors swung shut with a deep thud, bolts sliding home. Outside, the road fell silent. Inside, the gatehouse was a fortress, the architectural equivalent of a firm handshake that does not let go. Night duty began. The guardroom fire was built high, and the men drew lots for the parapet watch. Some wrapped in cloaks and went up to pace the walls, eyes sharp for lanterns or torchlight beyond. Others stayed below, listening for knocks on the postern door or horns from the countryside. The porter trimmed the lanterns along the passage so that any intruder would be well lit. Hospitality, but make it tactical. The sergeant, as ever, made his rounds with quiet, sharp steps. Yet even in weariness there was peace. The gatehouse was old and strong, and its men knew their craft. They shared stories to pass the long hours, of sieges past, of tricks to test a merchant's honesty, of ghosts said to haunt the deep archway at midnight. Some believed, some laughed, but all listened, grateful for talk against the cold dark. The walls listened too, as walls do, and promised to keep their secrets until properly bribed with limewash. Toward midnight the wind rose, howling through arrow slits. The brazier flickered low, boots clattered softly as the watch changed again. Far below, the moat rippled in the dark, a silent black ring around the castle, looking innocent and tasting of regret. Inside, the guardroom slept in turns, helmets beside them, spears propped within easy reach. Dreams here are practical. Sound hinges, a quiet horn, bread still warm at dawn. By the time first light crept pale and thin over the outer road, the gatehouse was ready to wake again. The night watch shook themselves free of sleep. The day guard arrived, stamping and yawning. The sergeant checked the chains and locks, satisfied with their soundness, music to a cautious soul. Then the drawbridge groaned downward, the portcullis rose, and the oak doors swung wide once more. The castle breathed out into the waking world, safe and strong behind its ancient teeth-polite smile restored, but do note the bite. Beneath the bright courtyards and guarded walls of a medieval castle lies another, darker world, the dungeon. Here stone passages descend into damp earth. Air grows cold and still. Torches gutter against wet walls. Torches have very clear boundaries, apparently. It is a place of fear and waiting, yet also of quiet endurance. For every glittering hall above, there is this shadowed undercroft below, where prisoners measure time by dripping water and the shuffle of the jailer's boots, which, to be fair, keep better hours than most courtiers. Most castles did not build dungeons as torture chambers alone. They were secure storage rooms first. Deep cellars kept wine and grain safe, but when power needed a place to hold enemies, the lowest vaults served multifunctional real estate before it was fashionable. Over Tave, some were purpose-built, barrel-vaulted stone rooms behind iron doors, or pits sunk deep where escape was nearly impossible. A heavy portcullis or oak door bound with iron bars sealed each entrance. Keys hung at the jailer's belt like a jangling sermon on prudence. To reach the dungeon you pass a twisting stair called a trap stair, narrow, uneven, meant to slow attackers and humble the unwary. Air cools and smells of earth and old smoke. Pride slips 2 steps lower, just keeping balance. Sometimes a passage runs under moat or through bedrock, dripping with moisture. Lantern light glints on rusty shackles fixed into stone, on iron grills that close tiny ventilation shafts. Far above, a single slit of daylight or the echo of footsteps reminds you that life continues overhead, loudly, expensively, and without you. The jailer, or gaoler, lives half in shadow too. Often a trusted servant of the lord or constable, he keeps keys, feeds prisoners, maintains locks and chains. His work is quiet but vital. A lax jailer might lose a valuable captive, and with it ransom or leverage no one wants to explain. Misplaced duke at staff meeting. Yet is it always cruel? Some speak gently to inmates, bring extra bread if allowed, or act as messenger for desperate letters. Others are feared brutes. The spectrum is wide, the keys jingle either way. Prisoners vary widely. Some are captured knights, held for ransom. Their stay can be surprisingly comfortable, with straw bedding, candles, and good food sent by family to encourage negotiation. Hostage hospitality is a genre. Others are thieves or rebels awaiting judgment, their cells bare, diet of stale bread and water, room service unresponsive. Political enemies, hostage nobles, even unlucky debtors might share close quarters. Each carves marks into stone to count days, because calendars are scarce and patience needs tallying. Daily life is slow. Morning brings the jailer's shuffle and clank of keys. He slides food through a hatch or enters with torch, announcing himself with that signature percussion. Prisoners rise stiff from straw, drink water from bucket, speak in low voices if sharing space. Some pray, some curse, some simply endure. An underrated talent. Light changes little, only faint glow through slit or lamp left to burn. Time blurs into drip, shuffle, sigh, the dungeon's idea of variety. Above, the castle lives on feasts, hunts, councils. Faint echoes sometimes reach down, thrum of music, clang of arms, a laugh that has never seen a draught. A prisoner hears life continuing, distant and unreachable. Yet messages can travel. Coins slipped to jailer bring news of ransom talks, family letters, even small comforts like better blanket or candle. Hope is a contraband that fits neatly under a cloak. Not all dungeons are equal. Some are simple locked rooms, others are grim oubliettes, narrow shafts with no door, or a grate above. Prisoner lowered by rope or ladder, then left with little contact. Such pits are rare but feared. Darkness and damp break spirits quickly. Gravity helps. Many castles, however, avoided such cruelty, preferring secure but livable cells, easier to keep ransoms healthy, which looks compassionate and accounts nicely. Torture is more legend than daily fact here. While some lords used threat or pain to extract confessions, routine dungeon life was mostly confinement, not spectacle. Far more common were chains to limit movement, stocks or pillory in courtyard, or simple cold hunger pains budget option. Still, tools existed. Rack, strappado, thumbscrews. Their shadow alone kept many compliant, nothing like decor with implications. Faith follows prisoners down. Crosses scratched into walls, prayers whispered in dark, bargains offered to heaven with the fine print removed. Chaplains or monks sometimes visit, bringing scripture, confession, or last rites. Condemned men carve names, saints, or pleas into stone, hoping some future soul will read and understand, or at least wonder. Candles blessed on holy days might flicker briefly in gloom, a tiny rebellion against damp and doubt. Season matters even here. Winter brings bitter cold and wet breath mists in air. Frost creeps across walls like quiet ivy. Summer may stink of rot and sweat. Water seeps in after storms to remind you nature pays no bail. Mice and rats are constant companions, terrible conversationalists, excellent survivors. The jailer battles mould and illness when he can, though prisoners often weaken from poor air and diet. The menu is consistent, reviews are not. Yet life persists. Captives trade stories, sing quietly to keep courage, scratch chessboards into floor, fashion dice from bread luck baked fresh daily. Some befriend jailer or mice, some write letters if literate. Knights might practice sword drills with wooden staves if allowed, dignity creaking like old hinges. Small rituals keep sanity, washing face with cold water, stretching, murmuring prayers at dawn, reciting a poem until it fits the cell. Occasionally freedom comes, a ransom paid, a truce signed, a pardon granted. Keys turn, door groans, prisoner steps blinking into light as if the sun has been promoted. Sometimes freedom means death. Condemned led to scaffold or gallows. Both fates begin with that same clank of lock one morning. Destiny has an oddly standardized soundtrack. The dungeon is also part of castle strategy. Holding a rival lord or enemy knight can win wealth and peace. Leverage looks best in chains. Threat of cell keeps local peasants loyal, or at least punctual. During siege, prisoners might be bargaining chips. The gaoler thus keeps careful record of who sleeps where, who owes what, who might escape. An accountant with fewer windows. Above all, the dungeon reminds that castles are not only homes but instruments of power. Stone keeps secure food, arms, and people, friend or foe, with the calm efficiency of gravity. To walk its depths is to feel that authority made real in chill air and iron bars, law that does not need to raise its voice because the walls do it for her. So when you imagine castle life, do not stop at banners and banquets. Picture also the dungeon, silent, cold, but alive with whispered hopes, the steady duty of the jailer, and the slow passing of days. Here power waits and watches, patient as stone, and just about as talkative, though considerably better at keeping appointments.